He's linked with Thomas Jefferson. And one of my goals today is to suggest that we can't do much better than reclaiming the Declaration of Independence as a fundamental foreign policy document in American history. I think we have a tendency to read it in a simplistic way and to think of it only as a sort of airy declaration of what were then human rights and a declaration of separation from England. But in fact, the founders had a fairly well-articulated sense of what they were doing with foreign policy and a fairly revolutionary sense of their foreign policy. So I'm quite interested in how Wilson rediscovers the founders and makes them relevant for his time. I suppose this thinking about Wilson began for me about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago. I came to be a speechwriter in the second term of Bill Clinton's presidency, and it was an unbelievably strange transition. As you can imagine, I was a completely obscure historian of Jacksonian America. I didn't even have a book out, but I'd been working on Manifest Destiny in the 1840s, and suddenly I was a foreign policy speechwriter. That was simply where the opening was. I had no training in foreign policy. But one adapts, and quickly under those circumstances, and I was quite interested in which presidents were considered historically interesting to Clinton and to the people around Clinton. And pretty quickly figured out it was John F. Kennedy, obviously, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, a little less obviously, but he was in there. And then Teddy Roosevelt, who was a huge influence on Bill Clinton and always has been. And to some extent, that may have just been Clinton's crass political calculation that he needed a Republican in the mix. I don't think he was averse to that kind of thinking, but I think he genuinely liked Teddy Roosevelt. There were paintings and statues of him everywhere, and he liked this robust model and the charisma and the progressivism. And it was a time in the 1990s when a lot of very favorable books were coming out about Teddy Roosevelt, Edmund Morris, H.W. Brands. There was a whole slew of books about him, and it was an attractive time to be thinking about Teddy Roosevelt. At the same time, I felt Wilson was completely ignored. I don't remember Clinton ever talking about Wilson. I'm sure he did. The collected speeches of Bill Clinton, I'm one of the few Americans to actually possess. It's something like 18 very fat volumes. The man enjoys speaking. And I'm sure if we looked up Wilson, we could find a few references, but very few. And I just thought, as a historian, that was fascinating. This other president from around the same time who did so much to create the world we live in was more or less invisible. And I also thought in some ways it echoed the equally interesting shifting reputations of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Not identical, of course, but in each case a northerner and a southerner, someone perceived to be a man of action and someone perceived to be a man of ideas. I mean, that's a gross oversimplification, but in some ways I thought it was similar. And so as I began work on this foreign policy book I've just finished, I looked a little into Wilson and the way people talk about him. And we're all very familiar with this sort of casual dismissal of Wilsonian idealism, which is a put down. I don't think it's ever used favorably in the press. George Bush vigorously denies that he's a Wilsonian idealist. And it's largely an accusation leveled at him, not something he claims for himself. Henry Kissinger's book, Diplomacy, opens with a discussion of Wilson versus Theodore Roosevelt, and he states it very clearly. One is an idealist, one is a realist. And it's a typically canny Kissinger strategy of talking. I remember when I basically worked for Sandy Berger, who was the National Security Advisor. And Kissinger was always dropping these asides in interviews about Berger that were very negative, very catty, saying, how can you expect a trade lawyer to be a global strategist? With the implication that Kissinger is a global strategist, an unparalleled strategist. And the equally strong implication of foreign policy is a rare monastic preserve that only a few people are privileged to enter into. And ordinary Americans can't possibly think about their foreign policy. It's too sophisticated, too European, too Metternickian. And I think that's an argument, I'll just say that right away, that I think liberals and progressives can win hands down. On the one side, you have honesty, democracy, the founders, the American way. And on Kissinger's side, Kissinger, Metternich, and the Holy Alliance. And I think we can win that fight. I think the tide may be about to turn for Wilson. One never knows these things, but it feels like a time of reevaluation might be approaching. I was thrilled to read Erez Manella's book. We haven't met yet, but I read it earlier this year, and I thought it really conveyed how important that moment was in 1919, when the entire world was looking to the United States for the first time in a serious way for a role model of what to do next. And Patty O'Toole's writing a Wilson biography, the author of a brilliant book on Henry Adams and his intellectual circle of the late 19th century. And we're approaching the 100th anniversary of Wilson's presidency and America's entry into World War I, which I think will be a very complicated moment of reevaluation, bringing out our complicated feelings about World War I, which are not simple at all, and about Woodrow Wilson. And I hope my book can make a small contribution. It's really only one chapter on Wilson in this long book, so I'm hardly a Wilson specialist. But I did enjoy the exercise a lot, and I do think he is a pivot for all of American history before him, converting it into the 20th century. For my research, I spent some time with the classic Wilson biographers, Link and John Morton Bloom, Richard Hofstadter. More than anything, I read his speeches, which was a pleasure. I am a kind of amateur historian, presidential oratory, and there are a lot of Wilson speeches. They're not that hard to find, and they're fascinating. I found them completely fascinating, and that, I would say, became my major source. I'm still reading them. I mean, you can read presidential speeches forever, and they're radically different from what came before. They're radically different from what Theodore Roosevelt was saying. I think we think of them as roughly equal levels of orators, but I think Wilson vastly exceeded Teddy Roosevelt. There's nothing in the late 19th century like him at all. You really have to go back to Abraham Lincoln for a sense that there's a mystical power in American history that's very forceful, that is acting through Wilson and through the American people and exerting considerable force on world events. You can call it naive and idealistic, and it's easy to find examples of naive phrasings in Wilson's oratory, but you can also say this person knew American history better than any president before him, probably better than any president since, or arguably, and knew the founding moment extremely well, Jefferson in particular, but Hamilton also, and knew the Civil War vividly and with firsthand knowledge. This has come out in biographies, but I think it's always worth restating that he was a war child. He grew up in a ravaged South. He saw destruction around him. He was not in peril himself, but he certainly lived in a South that was basically destroyed by the Civil War. Had a lifelong profound aversion to war. And he knew, as many people did, but I think with particular clarity, he knew that the moment he was living in was a moment of great destiny for the United States. He uses the word destiny. He uses the word providence a lot. And throughout the years of his presidency, you see him changing and evolving considerably. He comes in, of course, as an anti-war president, and even his second term, he promises to keep us out of war. But events conspire against him, and in April 1917, he leads the United States into World War I, where it exerted a decisive impact, a late entrance into the war, but a very decisive entrance, and there was nothing half-baked about it. Nearly 2 million soldiers were sent over. It was full war. It was the first European intervention by the United States, and it was a moment of tremendous change in the history of the United States that I don't think we give him proper credit for. It seems like our mixed memories and our largely negative memories are almost entirely rooted in the failed struggle to bring the U.S. into the League of Nations, and we overlook the considerable importance of the fact that he entered World War I at all. We can talk about his performance throughout the war. Certainly he made mistakes, many mistakes in 1919, but the general consensus is during the war itself he led effectively, and there's no better way to gauge his performance than to see the way the world looked at him as the war ended. which is perfectly captured in Erez Manella's book, The Wilsonian Moment, when he is basically, and H.G. Wells uses the word Messiah to describe the way people felt about him. So I consider him a most significant president and a most significant interventionist, and not someone who was so carried away with pacifism that he didn't act in the opposite direction when circumstances required it. He failed, of course, in the Versailles negotiations. He failed to win passage in the Senate of American entry into the League of Nations, and his health failed. And that basically is the worst thing, the cardinal sin of American politics is failure. And so that, I think, taints the way we remember him. But that does not mean at all that the ideas he was expressing were insignificant or insincere, or that his idealism didn't have a considerable amount of realism inside of it. And I end my meditation in this chapter with the thought that idealism is only idealism when it can't be achieved. But when you have the political willpower to make an idea happen, then it's not idealistic, then it's realistic. And I think many of us on both sides, Democratic and Republican, are still trying to live up to the ideas he expressed at the time. The chief Republican critique of Wilson at the time was that he was giving away something extremely valuable, which was American sovereignty. But I think we can parse this all day. What he was trying to do was to create a collective arrangement which required all parties to give up a certain amount of sovereignty to make the new arrangement work. It wouldn't have worked without it. It was a tiny amount of sovereignty, and no serious person thinks that the United States would have been threatened in any way by this, but that the way he talked about it and the way the Republicans talked about it allowed him to be perceived, I think, as articulating a weaker position than he actually had. And I don't want to preempt Erez Manella, but in fact, the ideas that he was expressing were really quite radical and new, and we're still, in many ways, trying to live up to them. They're in place in many ways that we accept without even thinking about it. We gave up sovereignty in 1949 when we entered NATO. We're giving up sovereignty every time we allow a new country into NATO, which we're doing a lot. We've been doing since Clinton's time, and we're still doing. I think very few Americans realize that if Turkey were attacked by any of its very dangerous neighbors, we are obligated by treaty to go to the defense of Turkey. So I say in my final paragraphs what I think about idealism and realism, and I also cite a few more modern ways that I think Wilson's legacy has been used and effectively since his death. FDR cites him quite movingly when he comes to take the nomination at Chicago in 1932. John F. Kennedy alludes to him briefly in his American University speech in 1963. Jimmy Carter gave a number of speeches that fit right into the Wilsonian rubric. I'm not sure that will strike Republicans as a stirring defense of Woodrow Wilson, but still, it's certainly in his speeches. I think Ronald Reagan, in many ways, was profoundly Wilsonian. It to me makes perfect sense that these buildings are cheek by jowl. That, in fact, I can't see where one begins and the other ends. But Reagan, in many of his speeches, in his famous speech to evangelicals in 1983, when he said, "America is great because America is good," that's a very Wilsonian thought, that virtue conveys political power and ultimately military power. Mikhail Gorbachev's important speech in 1988, when he basically proposed a new world in which the Soviet Union would renounce weapons and all countries would renounce weapons, and we would live by a more virtuous international standard. It's a profoundly Wilsonian speech. And then we get to George W. Bush, who has certainly given Wilsonian utterances, and it would be hard to find a better example than his second inaugural address, which pledged to end tyranny for all time. And yet I don't find him a sincere Wilsonian. It's one of the few areas in which I agree with George W. Bush. I don't think he is a Wilsonian. I think his speechwriters and advisors and he allowed themselves to use Wilsonian rhetoric when it was politically convenient. I don't think it was a sincere use of that rhetoric. I don't think there was anything like the learned understanding of American history that Wilson always had. I don't think there was anything like the implied commitment to egalitarianism and democracy that is in every Wilson speech. And certainly not to economic egalitarianism, which is an important concept that I hope we can talk about today, but which Franklin Roosevelt was certainly leading up to at the end of his presidency. So in my opinion, it's a kind of convenient rhetoric because it sounds good, but it was used in ways that Wilson would have been extremely uncomfortable with and profoundly opposed to. So I'll end with a few thoughts about what I think the liberal tradition in foreign policy might be defined as seen through the prism of Woodrow Wilson. Admiration for the full promise of the Declaration of Independence, which is a document we've had trouble living up to for our entire history. We take it for granted. It's just down Pennsylvania Avenue, and it is a difficult document to live up to. But Wilson, in speech after speech, talked about it. He went to Philadelphia just before leading the United States into war and called the Declaration of Independence a document leading up to war and an important statement of American foreign policy. It implies full political participation. Of course, we ourselves failed to live up to that for many decades and even centuries. Human rights, the word isn't used, but it's implied. And economic empowerment is also implied in a phrase like the pursuit of happiness. And every time another great document has been written, the Atlantic Charter, which Liz will talk about, or the Helsinki Accords, which aren't even really an American document at all, the Declaration of Independence, I believe, is very much in the background. So I think we need to take back the Declaration of Independence. Certainly a sense that diplomacy was broken and that we needed more open dealing between nations and that the European system was profoundly flawed. There was a system. It was the monarchical system and aristocratic emissaries between countries. And Wilson, like so many Americans before him, wanted to smash that system. And open covenants, openly arrived at, is also something with a direct link to the ideas about open diplomacy in the Declaration of Independence. The classic study, by the way, of the founders and their foreign policy is a very short, wonderful book called To the Farewell Address by Felix Gilbert, an absolutely brilliant distillation of what they were trying to do in foreign policy, which isn't read, I don't think, very often anymore, but easily found on eBay and a Libris. Fewer rituals of diplomacy, fewer complicated treaties with secret codicils, willingness to intervene in a just cause, which is an important and complicated point for Democrats to assume, but as I'm sure all of you know, for most of this century, until Vietnam, the Democrats were considered the party more likely to intervene than the Republicans. And I think it's important for us to return to that idea. I think Bill Clinton considered himself quite willing to intervene in a just cause. Someone with pacifistic tendencies, but no aversion to the use of force when the cause was morally just. And that's of course, an extremely complicated thing to parse out. But I think it's in the story of Woodrow Wilson, it's in the story of Franklin D. Roosevelt, it's in the story of democratic foreign policy in the 20th century. A devotion to free trade, another very complicated point. Democrats have not always been the strongest advocates of free trade, but that is a principle that goes back to the founders. The American Revolution, in a way, was a fight over free trade. Freedom of the seas is a codicil of that thought. A particular concern for Europe and its great relevance to the United States without thinking that European rituals are desirable, but nevertheless accepting that Europe is key to the stability of the United States. At the same time, a particular concern for the welfare of small nations, which Wilson talked about over and over and over again, and was seen in the international arena as the defender of small nations against England, France, and Germany. Self-determination, that very slippery concept that got him into so much trouble, and which we ourselves were not entirely living up to in the Wilsonian moment, the Palmer raids and the way black people were treated and women were treated certainly suggests we didn't have full self-determination of a sort. But nevertheless, this important thought I tried to say when talking about Henry Kissinger, that all people ultimately do have the right to shape their foreign policy. They not only have the right to elect their leaders, but as a consequence, they have the right to shape foreign policy. That's an important thought that I think Democrats should retain. And finally, a kind of airy thought, but an important one that's in everything Wilson said, and it's a most effective tool of persuasion, but this profound belief that a new time is coming, whether you think it's a religious new time or a political new time, but that nevertheless the disasters of the present can be solved and a new time is coming, and that's what we all feel in this room and in this year. Thank you.
Very much, Ted. Well, now we turn to FDR. Franklin Roosevelt's relationship to Woodrow Wilson and to Wilsonianism was, of course, a complicated one. FDR, one of my favorite metaphors or images of FDR is that offered by Warren Kimball in one of the best books about Roosevelt's foreign policy, which Kimball called him the juggler. Certainly, Wilsonianism was one of the balls that Roosevelt tried to keep in the air, but there were others, some of them I think of a decidedly different color. But nonetheless, it is fair to say that one of the aspects of FDR's legacy that's most admired and valued by contemporary liberals was his effort to provide a multilateral structure of institutions, including, of course, the United Nations, that gave form and substance to appeared to give form and substance to Wilsonian ideas in a way that Wilson himself was never able to do nearly as successfully. And so we're fortunate to have as our second speaker one of the most prominent leading historians of this moment, this multilateral moment, this making of the post-World War II international order, Elizabeth Borgward. Liz teaches history at, she's a historian, teaches at Washington University in St. Louis. And she's here, I think, above all because of a splendid prize-winning book of hers entitled A New Deal for the World, Americans' Vision for Human Rights, published in 2005, which analyzes the way in which planning for post-war international institutions grew out of the principles of the Atlantic Charter of 1941 and the way that transformed the idea of human rights in wartime American political thought. For an interdisciplinary conference of this sort, Liz is also an ideal speaker, I think, because before she would, although the words ideal, I had three of my children are lawyers, so I won't make any lawyer jokes, but Liz was an international lawyer before becoming a historian. She also has a degree in international relations. And she's continuing this work begun on A New Deal for the World with current work on the idea of crimes against humanity in history and memory. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Liz Borgward.
Good morning. Many thanks to all the people who designed and implemented this very innovative conference, but a particular thanks to Professor Nick Bromell for getting me involved and for sticking with me of the History and Democracy Project and the English department at UMass-Amherst, and also to Professor John Tirman of MIT's Center for International Studies, again for his contribution in helping me to get involved. I really appreciate the outreach. And also, of course, to Professor Rob Westbrook for agreeing to be our interlocutor. Rather than trying to frame the liberal internationalist tradition in some kind of grandiose way, I think Professor Westbrook is correct, and we were corresponding a little bit earlier, that maybe we should leave that to John Eikenberry. I read some forthcoming work of Eikenberry's where he offered a breakdown of the liberal internationalist tradition that had 13 facets, and sort of 25 sub-facets. I thought I would take a simpler framing from the subtitle of this conference as a whole, namely the pluses, problems, and prospects that I see offered specifically, in my case, in President Franklin D. Roosevelt's foreign policies. You can never speak of a unified policy with FDR, or the Rooseveltian foreign policy orientation may be the kind of locution that's more appropriate. My underlying paper, which I'm only going to draw upon for a few supporting examples in these more analytically focused and obviously brief remarks, is entitled All the Clauses to the Preamble in the Constitution Are Worth Fighting For, FDR's Four Freedoms and 1940s Era Transformations in America's Discourse of Rights. Okay, we're done, because I only get 20 minutes, so after reading that title, we're all set. But I'm using FDR's Four Freedoms address, which was his annual message to Congress, now more commonly known as the State of the Union address, from January of 1941, as a kind of touchstone for some of the ideas I raise in this framework of pluses, problems, and prospects. But first, let me give you the full quote from which all the clauses snippet is drawn. It's not Roosevelt himself, but someone who was sort of flacking for Roosevelt, the University of Chicago politics professor Charles Merriam, perhaps a role model for those of us who are academics, who also happened to serve as one of the deputy heads of a New Deal agency, the National Resources Planning Board. And Merriam, in his capacity as NRPB official, is going around the country making speeches trying to explain what Roosevelt meant, in the meaning of the president's address, where Roosevelt spoke of the four essential human freedoms everywhere in the world: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And this is part of a kind of transition during the course of 1941, if I may speak very specifically, of the Four Freedoms idea into a kind of war aim. At the juncture where Roosevelt makes his address, the United States is, of course, 11 and a half months away from actually being at war. But part of the initial impetus for the Four Freedoms section of this speech was Roosevelt being asked in a series of press conferences how he would write the next piece. Because, of course, Europe already at war, and so this framing is very much on everyone's mind throughout the course of 1941. And so it's, again, the underlying paper talks in some detail of this sort of march of the Four Freedoms towards becoming a war aim. And Merriam is very much speaking in that vein. So Merriam is giving the 1941 Edwin Lawrence Godkin Lecture on Democracy at Harvard, where he says, "Someday it will dawn upon us that all the clauses in the preamble to the Constitution are worth fighting for. Justice was the first term in the Constitution's preamble and liberty the last. But in between them came the general welfare, common defense, and domestic tranquility." And this quality of articulating values worth fighting for, tip of the hat to Rob Westbrook, who's written an entire fantastic book on this exact topic. The idea of values worth fighting for and articulating them in terms of domestic justice and stability is reflected in the rest of the speech, where Merriam makes explicit links between the internal and external realms, and he lays out what comes to be called in a subsequent series of pamphlets, Your Economic Bill of Rights, again, drawing directly from the Roosevelt speech, specifically as a national security aim. So starting with this quality of reciprocity, of congruence between the internal and the external, I want to highlight four qualities which, to my mind, reflect pluses, I guess, in this model of pluses, problems, etc., of the pluses of what Isaiah Berlin called the Rooseveltite orientation. And I'll list these 4 qualities quickly and then give a concrete example of each, and then I'll conclude by listing 4 problems I see with these qualities, although I think the problems will be obvious. And maybe we can save the prospects section for the discussion, since there are so many experienced policymakers and policy analysts here as participants. I think analogies will occur to you that are more interesting than the ones which have occurred to me, contemporary analogies. So these 4 pluses are Merriam's conception of reciprocity, on which I'll elaborate a little bit in a moment. Secondly, the power of ideas, often framed as thin, aspirational rhetoric, to energize constituencies that then thicken the meaning of the rhetoric and fill in the content in a way that actually affects policy or changes behavior. Thirdly, an inflation of the idea of security, both domestic and international, to encompass a set of preconditions about, I would say more about stability, including economic stability. And finally, fourthly, an openness to multilateral influences, both in the formation of policy and in its revision and critique, which I think is a slightly different point than saying multilateralism good, unilateralism bad. I'm mindful that Charlie Mayer, who's just leaving the room, who'll be speaking later, is basically saying that we need to, speaking about the perils of too much weight on multilateralism as a process, and so I'm mindful of that. But all 4 of these elements that I'm terming pluses, I think work together to do one thing, and that is to reframe the concept of the national interest so that it breaks out of this sterile binary question of, is the U.S. acting self-interestedly versus what, first of all, altruistically, and instead reframes that question, reframes the very idea of self-interest, is expanded to encompass, for example, institutions for international justice or for economic stability. Okay, so these examples will be quick, but we're back to Charles Merriam. Merriam indicates that there are 2 great objectives that democracies have in the field of what he calls world relationships. First, the secure, and this is Merriam's language here, the security of a jural order, Jural order of the world, in which decisions are made on the basis of justice rather than violence. And secondly, the fullest development of the national resources of all nations and fullest participation of all peoples in the gains of civilization. So this sort of material and domestic piece of it as well. And so this is wonderful New Deal language about gains of civilizations. And again, I make an argument in the paper at some length that this conceptual congruence between the internal and the external is particularly Rooseveltian. Secondly, the point about the power of ideas, this dynamic of thickening aspirational rhetoric through the workings of international institutions or other kinds of institutions, I think can be illustrated, well, any number of ways, but I'll illustrate it through the way the Nuremberg tribunal, what the Nuremberg trial was designed. And here I mean the main flagship tribunal that was sitting in 1945, 1946. And this is actually not in my paper, using this as an example. It's from my new project. The Nuremberg Charter was, of course, not negotiated until after FDR's death in August of 1945. But the negotiators, of whom, of course, New Dealer Supreme Court Justice Robert F. Jackson was a leader on the U.S. side. These negotiators were explaining their task, as they do extensively in writing and memoirs and transcripts of their negotiations, as operationalizing freedom from fear. In other words, we're giving life to the 4 freedoms. We're one of these institutions, like the United Nations organizations, like the Bretton Woods organizations, that are sort of constitutionalizing the 4 freedoms. If the 4 freedoms is a sort of thin aspirational Declaration of Independence type document, then the charters of these international organizations are sort of the constitutions, and the workings of the institutions will, again, they don't use the term thicken, but will thicken the international politics and express the four freedoms. And I think that the specific language that they use is that Nuremberg is supposed to be about freedom from fear of aggressive war, right? They're stretching a little bit, but that's how they're trying very hard to make the link, and it's important to them to make the link. I think that the trial shared other Rooseveltian qualities too, such as administrative chaos, conceptual incoherence, heavy-handed didacticism. But it was meant to be, and a lot of people forget this, I think. I mean, a lot of analysts forget this, that Nuremberg was originally meant to be a first step on the road to a permanently sitting international criminal court, which of course we don't realize until, we don't have that charter until much, much later. But the American judge Francis Biddle is writing and speaking in 1946 after Nuremberg and says, okay, now we're ready to take the next step for a permanently sitting international criminal court. And not that such an institution would really deter, much less prevent, various kinds of bad behavior, but this notion is that it was meant to be a step on the road towards ending impunity, and that by developing norms of international justice. Now, there are all kinds of problems, obviously, with Nuremberg, but it's also Rooseveltian in the sense that it got the job done, that there was a consensus, even those who were dismissive of Nuremberg at the time, that it was probably better to do it than not to do it. It made it over some kind of legitimacy line, maybe just over the line for certain critics. Okay, thirdly, stability as a possibly more fruitful avenue or precondition for security. I think today's obsession with security can be tugged aside to reveal what is really a very desiccated and shrunken notion of stability, right? That Musharraf must stay in power is stability. A conception from which the idea of justice has been sucked out and abandoned. But I think this idea of stability as linked to justice was perceived by many Roosevelt administration planners as being one of the key lessons of the Wilson era, frankly, that one of the major failings of the League of Nations system had been that it privileged an overly simplistic, almost litigation-type model of international conflict, right? That international conflicts in the future were going to be things like boundary disputes between nations that could be arbitrated, and that really discounted. They didn't really look for ways to engage. This is the League system now, not really looking for ways to engage member countries that would be so discontented with the international system as it stood that they would seek, in effect, to kick over the table. They wouldn't want to be litigators. They would want to be spoilers. And I think you can look at, in the Rooseveltian era, the Bretton Woods system or the Marshall Plan as responses to what were perceived as some of these lessons from the Wilson era. And so I think you can see the Marshall Plan particularly, but also the Bretton Woods regime to a certain extent as anti-Soviet gestures, but that's not all that they were. Fourth and finally, I mentioned transnational influences. One of the strengths of Rooseveltian institutions designed to operationalize this rhetoric of the four freedoms, and looking at the folks who negotiated the negotiations around the United Nations Charter, the Bretton Woods Charters for the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and again, even the Nuremberg Charter, although somewhat counterintuitively, that was that they had an implicit vision of sovereignty, not as a kind of stack of poker chips to be hoarded, but more as a process whereby if decision-making authority were spread around even just a little bit, and of course let's be realistic about the limits of this, but it would induce, I would say, it would induce buy-in from a wider variety of players who would perceive this process as legitimate, or at least minimally legitimate enough to entice their participation and reduce incentives to serve as a spoiler, to kick over the table, and thereby entrench and extend American interests, right? I mean, I think that was it self-interested debate is a strange one to me. Of course it was self-interested on the part of U.S. policy planners. But having said that, the aspect of this Rooseveltian multilateralism that interests me the most is, frankly, the unintended consequences that sprang up of a more open channel for transnational influences on American policy. And I think that, one example would be the critique that sprang up of the so-called Dumbarton-Oaks draft of the United Nations Charter, right? In the summer and autumn of 1944, you've got this 4-power draft, really a 3-power draft, because China was just invited in to basically to rubber stamp it. A great power draft, in effect, that was being touted as this is the blueprint for the conference that's coming in the spring, the United Nations San Francisco Conference. And smaller countries formed coalitions, NGOs formed coalitions, and said, well, I don't think so. What about these 4 freedoms rights, these Atlantic Charter rights that we saw ourselves as fighting for and making sacrifices for? And the most focused critique, I think, was the 19 Latin American nations that got together in February of 45 to critique the Dumbarton-Oaks draft. In Chapultepec Castle in Mexico, chaired by Mexican Foreign Minister Ezequiel Padilla, who had fought with Pancho Villa, and to say specifically, where's the International Bill of Rights that is supposed to be annexed to this Constitution, namely the United Nations Charter? And arguably, it made the resulting United Nations Charter that much more incoherent, that certain vague references to human rights were sort of grafted on post hoc, but they certainly wouldn't have been there otherwise, absent that transnational dialogue and critique. All right, so I want to, in conclusion, list quickly 4 items under the problems heading. And I'm really just going to list them because I think they sort of leap out at us. But for number 1, reframing is wimpy, and ideas don't affect the workings of power and interest anyway. Why would we study ideas? Number 2, maybe we ought to be thinking about kicking over the table. This mirrors the critique of the domestic New Deal, right? That it merely served to save capitalism when capitalism was itself the problem, and that the system was broken, both domestically and internationally, and that's why you see so much hypocrisy in going from the rhetoric to the reality. And domestically, I'd mention, the internment of Japanese Americans, the invidious racial policies on the home front during America's World War II as just 2 examples of this kind of hypocrisy. But the idea that this is intrinsic to the liberal message and legacy. These are not exceptions. Thirdly, a third problem is, shouldn't those of us who are historians be Charles Beard type dissenters rather than court historians, in effect, like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. or others who I could mention more contemporaneously, but won't. But is that really the choice? I mean, are we really choosing between? Is it that stark, right? Are we outside and we're Charles Beard, or we're the court historian? Why can't we be Samantha Power, for instance, combining policy advocacy and working for change with our scholarship? And I think that the structure of that setup, because there are so many historians here, I think suggested saying, well, I have this and that criticism of Power scholarship or whatever. I mean, I have issues with the way she uses Raphael Lemkin's papers, for instance, to talk about genocide. But I'm excited that she's using Raphael Lemkin's papers, and we can debate about it. So I think there's another space, again, besides throwing up our hands and saying, it's broken and we won't participate. And finally, the critique that there's nothing new here, that we can't talk about transformative moments under FDR's administration, under Wilson's administration, or any other administration, because there are always antecedents, and the real story is about, the texture and the nuance that these images that focus on a more kind of punctuated equilibrium leave out, and that should be the center of gravity, and that, in effect, we can't really communicate with a wider reading public about these ideas because it's just too complicated. To which my reaction, in conclusion is, give me a break. As a former litigator, I know that when you make an argument before the U.S. Supreme Court, and I think there are people in this room who've actually done that, I am not among them, but you have basically 20 minutes to boil down years of complex litigation into its essence. And that being able to actually do this effectively is a sign of intelligence and sophistication and not sophistry. And, I watch academics on talk shows, and I read them in the media, sort of sigh and say, well, it's so complicated, which may be part of this kind of tyranny of the expert that Professor Widmer was discussing in connection with Henry Kissinger. In other words, I know so much that I can never communicate it to you. But I agree that it is complicated, okay? And I think, however, that we could do better. Thank you very much.
Now, as I said, I've never been an interlocutor, but I'm pretty sure interlocutors don't get up and walk to the podium. They remain seated, so I'll do that. Unfortunately, the interlocutor that comes to mind for me first is James Lipton, but I don't.
You get the blue colors.
Well, I don't think we want to do inside the actor's studio here, so I won't take that as a negative reference. As I see it, my role is not to comment on these papers, but rather to pose some questions that the papers suggest to me, and thereby begin a conversation, and I hope a debate, not only between myself and the speakers, but not least between myself and the speakers, but between the speakers themselves, and also perhaps, I would hope, above all, with you. That is, that although I think it's only fair to allow Ted and Liz to have the first word, I hope all the rest of you will jump in at the first opportunity. Now, if you've seen the copy of Ted Widmer's paper, he has a wonderful epigraph from Woodrow Wilson that I plan to put on the door of my office. It is a wonder that historians who take their business seriously can sleep at night. But I'd like to begin with an epigraph of my own. And this is from a letter that Charles Beard, who Liz mentioned, one of the greatest historians of the 20th century, and an important political scientist as well. In a letter that Beard wrote in January of 1936 to Oswald Garrison Villard, who was the former publisher and editor of the Nation. And I'd like to use this as a kind of epigraph for my own question. Beard said to Villard, he said, "We need an expose on the Wilson-FDR mythology. But most of the people who deal with foreign affairs live by keeping up the mythology." Unquote. Now, my interest in this conference, I'm an historian. I'm interested in the past and in Wilson and FDR, certainly. But the reason I'm here, and I suspect the reason many of us are here, has less to do with the past than with the present, or to be more precise, with questions of continuity and discontinuity between the past and the present. And so even though I'm an historian, I probably wouldn't be here were it not for the events of the past 7 years, which I regard as a disastrous period in the history of American foreign policy. So what draws me to this conference is an effort to try to figure out whether liberal internationalism offers us a way out, liberal internationalism of the sort identified with Wilson and Roosevelt affords us a way out of this disaster, or, on the other hand, as my quotation from Beard suggests, whether it has served to get us into it. Now, I'm not an expert, but as a citizen, reading debates and discussions on recent American foreign policy, I see at least three different positions that have emerged on this question of continuity and discontinuity. On the one hand, there are many, both proponents, supporters of the foreign policy of George W. Bush, and critics, some very harsh critics even, of Bush foreign policy, who have described it as deeply Wilsonian. Indeed, one Bush supporter went so far as to say that George W. Bush is the most Wilsonian president since Wilson himself. Now, on the other hand, some self-described Wilsonians or neo-Wilsonians, most of whom are Democrats, even liberal Democrats, have tried to draw a bright line between themselves and the Wilsonian tradition and Bush. And then finally, there's a third, more complicated position, which has tried to, in some measure, protect the liberal internationalist legacy of Wilson and FDR from both Bush and from these neo-Wilsonians, and has charged that by virtue of the neo in neo-Wilsonians thinking, they are at least as responsible as the Bush administration and the neoconservatives for the calamities of recent American foreign policy. Now, I realize that where one comes down on this question depends much on on interpretations of what exactly is Wilsonian, or what exactly liberal internationalism means. But that's, after all, the question we were asked to address. I pretty much have a single question, or a variation on this, a set of variations on the same question for Ted and Liz, and that's simply where do you stand on this question of continuity and discontinuity? Or we might say, in light of recent history, what do you think? And they've already begun to address this question, maybe because I told them I was going to ask it. They've already begun to address this question, which is, what is living and what is dead in this, or even better, what is deadly in this Wilsonian liberal internationalist tradition. And especially from my point of view, it's a difficult question to answer, because it seems to be that in many respects what is troubling or deadly about this tradition is tightly bound up or imbricated in its virtues, that the two are very difficult to separate out. But above all, if I can lay my own Beardian cards on the table, above all, what seems to me the problem here, the troubling thing here, is what I would describe as the missionary position of liberal internationalism. And that seems to me characteristic of Wilsonianism, both old and new. And if that missionary position is in fact essential to the tradition and is responsible or culpable for some of the difficulties in which it's to which it's brought us, I wonder whether, without necessarily kicking over the table, whether what we need to do is to critically, in a deeply critical way, reconsider this tradition and try to work ourselves into a more modest, less hegemonic posture of the sort that I have to admit would be a decided break with the ambitions of much, if not most, of the American past.
Do you want us to?
Yeah, that's the question.
Okay. All
I think you should have the first word. Yeah.
I mean, it's such a great question. It's so stimulating. But I mean, I think that there are substantial and serious schools of thought. I mean, this Beardian strand is just one of them that I think from the very beginning see any attempt to project American power, interest, values beyond its own borders as inherently pernicious. Bretton Woods is a mask for one kind of economic imperialism, and human rights are a mask for another kind of imperialism. And I think that's a sort of central question: is that really where we are, or can we make an argument that I realize needs to have, texture, nuance, you may say equivocation, about, are there some criteria? And I mean, I think the best thing is to think in terms of specific examples. I mean, I had been asked also to speak about prospects, and I didn't. So let me give a more current example. But, I think in 2004, in the last year of Charles Taylor's regime in Liberia, we have a ship full of Marines 3 miles off the coast when there's, horrible conflict going on in Monrovia. Parents, dragging their children to the American embassy and begging for help and relief. The people want intervention. The Marines wanted to intervene. They could literally see with their high-tech Tom Clancy-type binoculars what was going on. Charles Taylor did not want intervention. And I think that and we did not intervene, P.S., and there was a massive slaughter. And I think that it's very easy to say, again, as I mentioned in the remarks, multilateralism good, unilateralism bad, so maybe if it's laundered through some kind of multilateralist process, then that helps, or there's a higher threshold if intervention is unilateralist. But I think it's also, I don't know, I was just having dinner last night with Alita Black, who does a lot of work in Liberia, and saying that there are criteria such as, a long-standing relationship with that particular country, relationships with strong dissident communities within the country, where, I think you can make a case for various kinds of interventions, and they don't need to be, that's a very dramatic example, but, intervention doesn't mean military intervention. One more quick example of a non-military example is the Vital Voices Project, right, which is about micro-lending and has a focus on Latin America. It's a bipartisan 501c3 organization. It's chaired now by actually Hillary Clinton and Nancy Kassebaum. It was funded through the State Department originally, and then, of course, defunded under the current administration. But, is accepting a microloan that has its origin in an American bank for, Bolivian sewing circle, is that, economic imperialism? Maybe it is, but I think, careful attention to criteria and context is the only way that we're going, or the best way to get ourselves out of this box where we say, look, it's too tightly woven, the virtue and the tendency for overreaching evil, whatever, that you just have to turn your back on the whole project.
I'm not quite sure whether I'm talking about interventions and what makes them worthwhile or not, or the larger question of continuities with the past. Try to talk a little bit about each. The feeling I've come to about Wilson is that the very word Wilsonian is a hard word to use and to understand, because there are so many Wilsons, and you can see him unfolding every year or two in his presidency. But there's the Wilsonian who's essentially a pacifist who's elected in 1912. And then there's the Wilson who leads America very decisively into war in 1917. Then there's the great hero of the world in 1919 in The Wilsonian Moment, title of Erez's book. And that's a very important Wilson, the Wilson who's speaking to and for all of the peoples of the world who don't have a voice at Versailles. And then there's the tragic Wilson of the final years, sick and broken and incapable of negotiating with anyone or compromising. And I think we need to separate out those Wilsons and pick the ones we want to be continuous with. And I think I largely admire the first three. I especially admire the one in 1919 who's articulating America's purpose to a global audience, and I think that's something we are very far from at the present. We largely have lost something that was essential, which you have in moments like John F. Kennedy in Berlin or Ronald Reagan in Berlin, where an American president is articulating the hopes of the world for change. And we have no credibility in that respect right now, and we need badly to get back to it. I don't think we need continuity with Wilson, the man who was incapable of negotiating with Republicans. I mean, that was obviously a very flawed Wilson. So we need, as we move forward and try to think of a progressive foreign policy tradition, it needs to include a willingness and an ability to compromise and negotiate with Republicans, because there are a lot of Republicans who are as disenchanted with George W. Bush as well. So that'll be a fundamental part of the new politics coming into being in the next year or two. As far as interventions, it's an incredibly difficult thing to be precise about and what makes an intervention good or bad. In the Clinton administration, I think you could see a lot of rationale based on what had happened just before. And this is only my theory. Speechwriters have we are present in a sense in the White House, but we have no policymaking authority whatsoever. But it seemed to me that the disastrous intervention in Somalia in the fall of '93, which was based largely on the fact that George H.W. Bush had intervened in Somalia first. So Clinton was trying to continue something that had already begun under his predecessor, and that was a very difficult and failed intervention. That led, I believe, to the reticence to intervene in Rwanda, which was a catastrophe also, a catastrophe of non-intervention. But I think it was the regret over Rwanda that gave so much desire and energy to the desire to intervene in Kosovo. I mean, that plus the Bosnia precedent. So I think we always need to think about what has happened just before, which is tough. I mean, because the thing that's about to happen is not going to be the same as the thing that has just happened. But I think in the Clinton experience, there was a growing sense that intervention was good, despite the early missteps, and most presidents have early missteps. John F. Kennedy certainly did in the Bay of Pigs. There was a growing sense, and by the end of the presidency, a very confident sense, that American power was a force for good in the world. And I think I don't feel very sympathetic with the Beardian analysis. I think power is what we want. We've been out of power for quite a long time. Democrats have been, and academics even more. And we should be frank, power is what we seek, and we need to be comfortable with it.
Let me be more precise, if I may, and then take a question from the audience. It seems to me that the issue that, at least for me, and I think for many, that elicits the question is the way in which conceptions of, say, legitimate human rights intervention or legitimate democracy promotion have extended to authorization to reshape the domestic societies and politics of other polities. And the question is that something new in the Wilsonian tradition, or is that implicit, evident from the beginning? And if so, is that something that is troubling, or something that is a legitimate exercise of power? So it seems to me you could argue that for an intervention in the Taylor case, as you described it, or Rwanda, I'm not saying that that you preclude certain kinds of limited human rights interventions, but to go in and remake the world in America's image, which seems to me Wilsonian. In at least there is an element of that in Wilson. Is what is troubling, and it seems to me to be characteristic of this tradition to expand that the only thing precluding its expansion into that kind of missionary remaking the world is occasional prudence. That, as a matter of principle, that is at the heart of the tradition.
Well, I mean, I want to hear from people. We just because I felt like initially I didn't answer your question, so I want to have another cut with this more precise formulation. I mean, I think that it's not so much Wilsonian, as sort of seeing what you want to see in the other, right, which is really more like the human condition, I think. And this kind of cherry picking that you're talking about in terms of saying, well, there's always pressure to intervene and to remake other societies, other polities in the U.S. image, and it's just kind of opportunistic that modified by, I don't know, norms like prudence or proportionality or whatever, but the opportunity is what the U.S. is sort of constantly searching for. Again, I think can be the modification comes through. I mean, I'm really interested in the work of the political theorist Ian Shapiro, for instance, at Yale, where he's saying, it's really you have to look at what's already in that society that may or may not be coming to meet you, not being like the United States, but I mean, his interest is in opposition groups. His interest is in democratization, and so he's interested in democratic opposition groups and how strong they are and whether it ever makes sense for the U.S. to support them. So not talking about a full-on military intervention that's remaking a society or not in the aftermath of, remaking it through chaos and violence, as in the aftermath of the Iraq invasion, or remaking it actively through reshaping its institutions. But he's saying, well, let maybe the more interesting middle ground are interventions where the U.S. says it advances our interests to support democracy around the world. How do we construe that? How do we operationalize that interest? And so he looks at opposition groups in non-democratic societies, right, that are supporting democracy. And he says that it's gotten him into a real snitch, a real pickle, because all he could come up with was to say, well, the internal opposition has to be strong enough that basically U.S. external support is just giving them a kind of boost on a path that they're on already. And people say, well, the criticism of that is, well, that means, the sort of worst authoritarian dictator and civil and human rights oppressor then gets the opposition to that regime gets the least amount of assistance, right? Because it's going to have the weakest kind of opposition. And so, but is the other answer then not to support? Because again, it might be imperialistic, or it might be a projection of values. But I have to say, I get a little impatient with. I'm sort of hesitating even to use the word intervention now, right? Because it's become such a dirty word, or to talk about this idea of the projection of values. But whose values would people have the U.S. project, if not their own? And so I think it does. I think there are questions of prudence that shape outcomes in a way that's actually very important. Sorry, no.
Well, I'll just say something quickly, and then I can turn to questions. But it's a very provocative question, Rob, and
Great question.
I'm also kicking myself that I didn't use the missionary position as a chapter title. It might not be too late.
I just stayed away from it.
Yeah. One thought I'll just throw out quickly is this impulse is very deep in our history. I think we're wrong to say interventionism or a global aspiration begins in 1898, because I think it's in the works. It's in the marrow of American thinking far earlier than that. We just don't have any power before 1898. And that's what's so interesting about 1898 and about 1917, is that American power has finally caught up to America's aspiration to be a real moral force in the world. But it's an ancient tradition, and it has good and bad aspects. But it's throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, you see expressions of this thought, and it'll all be out in my book in a couple months. But there's one way to tweak the argument that I just want to say quickly, which is to say remake societies instantly is a negative way of describing what we are talking about. If you say to allow societies to be themselves, it sounds much better. And that is ultimately what democracy is. It's allowing countries to express their own aspirations. And it's two ways of saying pretty much the same thing. If you say we want Liberia, how so?
These are two countries.
But if we say, well, any country, if we say we want a country to have a working economy and a bipartisan system with a meaningful opposition and institute and a press and safe systems of governance and following rules, then that's something no one, Republican or Democrat, would disagree with. But we are saying we would like you to operate in the model of the United States. So I think language is very important. If we say we want you to be like the U.S., we're going to get into trouble. But if we say we want you to be a working, modern country with fair systems and belonging to the global system, then it's a better way of saying the same thing.
Just quickly, Professor Marion, that why isn't Rwanda? Why isn't it more like Belgium, for instance, right, where there are competing groups who don't like each other and talk periodically about splitting apart? It's I don't even
all I was
that's
saying is when you talk about a country being itself,
right.
and you take a country which seems to be pretty hopelessly at war with itself, that's not. You've got to have some guidance about which part.
Well, that too is a somewhat meaningless phrase, being itself, but all I meant is that it should have a chance to express itself politically. And this was very interesting, I thought, when Hamas won the elections in Palestine. Everyone freaked out, but that was a democratic vote that was fair. And we need to be more comfortable with negative outcomes of democratic votes and to still work with countries after those kinds of votes.
Although Wilsonians aren't. That is, the minute Hamas won the election, the Wilsonians at Princeton went back to the drawing board and said, well, we mean liberal democracy, not democracy of any sort. And how are you allowing a country to be itself when you lay out a set of criteria by which you will determine whether or not they are being themselves, which are essentially your criteria for being yourself? Yes.
I'm Jeffrey Herf. I'm at the University of Maryland. The panel is entitled Historical Assessments of Wilson and Roosevelt, and it's gone on now for an hour and 15 minutes. And so I find it interesting that the panelists have not said a word about Roosevelt and the Second World War. And Roosevelt as a wartime leader against Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. This, in my view, is part of the core of the liberal tradition in foreign policy. And part of the great problem of American liberalism is that too many of its advocates don't read other languages, don't really understand or are interested in the foreignness of foreign affairs, have difficulty understanding that there are people that despise the United States and at various times have wanted to attack it, but that Roosevelt was one of those liberals who understood all of that. He was truly a cosmopolitan leader who grasped the differentness and foreignness of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and also understood the threat they posed to American national security conventionally understood. And it's revealing to me that we've gone on so long, and that has not entered into this discussion. So my question to the panel is, why have you not spoken about that?
Well, let me just jump in there and help out the panel here, because John and I are partly responsible for that. We knew that national security was inevitably going to come up in any conversation of this kind. But we also felt that there are other aspects of the liberal international tradition that really need to be thought about, because national security tends to preempt them. It's the preemptive topic. And so we have encouraged all of the panelists, in fact, we framed the whole conference, to subordinate, if you will, this precise issue that you think is so important and we agree is very important, in order to allow these other issues to get adequate airing. So,
let me rephrase it.
It's not really, I'm saying that if there's a blame here, it lies with John and myself, not with the panel. But that said, if you have a response that you would like to give now, that's
Let me
fine.
rephrase it in a sentence.
Yeah.
After Pearl Harbor, there was a revolution in the history of American foreign relations. And the United States government made the decision, Roosevelt made the decision, and no president has undone it, that the national security interests of the United States begin across on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. What you're suggesting, with nuance, language, whatever, is that you want to undo that revolution. Professor Westbrook in particular, and that you want to read out the Roosevelt's war policy out of the liberal tradition. And the omission is a statement. And as a historian, I find that troubling to leave that out.
Okay, well, with respect, I mean, I think it starts before Pearl Harbor. Actually, I mean, it's I realize I'm using the Roosevelt for Freedom speech, the Atlantic Charter, the statements of war aims that come even before Pearl Harbor as kind of a trope, but they were statements of war aims. The Atlantic Charter was war and peace aims 4 months before Pearl Harbor, and this was a very brave thing for FDR to do, considering the strength of his isolationist constituencies at that time. And so, I mean, I think if a discussion of war aims is not close enough to a discussion of World War II era foreign policy, then, I mean, do you mean battles and military campaigns? I mean, I think it's the actual Four Freedoms Address is a great example of exactly what you're talking about, Roosevelt's cosmopolitanism, where he frames it as the actual speech. Percussively, he lists each of these criteria, and then he says, everywhere in the world, everywhere in the world. And reportedly, Harry Hopkins said to him beforehand, Mr. President, I just really don't think that the American people are going to care about the four freedoms for the people of Java. To which FDR reportedly responded, well, they're going to have to someday, Harry, so they might as well start now. And I think the contrast between Roosevelt's vision and the, say, standard, Professor Westbrook and I have both written about this, the Norman Rockwell vision of the four freedoms, right, which is domestic in both senses of that term, right, domestic, not international, domestic images of home and hearth as what U.S. is fighting for, is not Roosevelt's vision at all. Roosevelt's vision was explicitly international.
I didn't give a paper, but let me take the bull by the horns and say absolutely, I don't think you're wrong. I think that people that feel as I do have to engage that question directly. And I'm arguing via people like, I think, for one thing, I think the isolationists have gotten a bad rap historically. But setting that aside, I think that what was initiated at Pearl Harbor was a process, to use Liz's term, which she put under pluses and I would put under minuses, was an inflation of American understanding of what its national security requires and where it lies. Now, we can argue about where it lies, but my argument is, my concern is that it's become vastly overinflated, and that it began, and that an increasingly inflated understanding of national security is implicit, if not and often explicit, in this liberal internationalist tradition, and that is problematic. Yes, I'm willing to engage in that argument. I think if one takes my position, one has to engage in that argument, because inevitably, not just in academic conferences, in any bar in America, when you make my argument, it's what about the Nazis? What would you have done about Hitler? And so forth. And you have to answer that question. You have to address it directly. But that said, apart from the particulars of that case, what I am saying, indeed, is that you're right. Roosevelt was responsible for initiating an enormous extension of the notion. If you can actually look at the use of the term national security in the literature, both popular and elite, and there is a steady inflation of the term, and I think I would argue that is a part of this tradition, that's inherent in this tradition, and I'm trying to suggest that perhaps that's a problem with this tradition. Problematic, yes, absolutely.
There are so many people. I don't know if you want to get a few or how you want
Yeah, back there.
Right, we need to use the mic, don't we? If you don't mind, I'll drag us back into the past for a moment, back to Wilson.
Who are you?
John Cooper, sorry, University of Wisconsin. By the way, I'm glad you're not afraid of sticking up for the isolationists. I agree with you. They have gotten a bad rap. I don't agree with them, but Beard himself was a very, very smart man. I think he went badly off later with that conspiracy theories, but that is not discredit. That's not a discredit to Beard. I've often thought that if Wilson's ghost were around.
This is the voice of Madison, Wisconsin, by the way.
No, it
So
is
was
not.
mine, by the way, 1969.
No. Well, you're in the Madison, Wisconsin tradition. I ain't. I've often thought that Wilson's ghost could say the same thing that Marx once said. I'm no Marxist, just Karl Marx. I think he could say, and I think this has come out rather well here from both your papers, that he could say, hey, I'm no Wilsonian, just Woodrow Wilson. Now, Ted, I wouldn't agree with you quite, though. Yes, I think you're right to say that there are different Wilsons that he changes. Of course he did. In fact, he was very proud of that. He said, in fact, at one point, he said, if I don't keep up, this was a deeply held view, which he took actually from his study of political science, that if I don't keep up, I'm a back number. So that this constant. But on the other hand, I think there is a thread. I think there's very definitely a thread that goes through there. And I would argue it isn't missionary. About the only time, and I think Arthur Link, in fact, dragged a red herring across this when he called his Latin American policy missionary diplomacy, because, hey, you've got these two guys, Wilson and Bryan, who are so religious, right? They come in and, hey, they're going to get in there and really remake those. It was actually a much more opportunistic thing. It was, well, hey, got all this trouble down in Latin America, and we got this tradition, as you said, as I think Liz points out, where did you come from before that? Well, we've been intervening down there a lot, and these Republicans have done it for the wrong reasons. What the hell? We may as well do it for the right reasons now. And then, of course, he got badly burned in Mexico, which was, again, an excellent learning experience for him. I think then, I think you can see these going through. Just one more point on this. The most famous phrase in his war address reads, "The world must be made safe for democracy." Now, Ted, you're a former speechwriter. Who was Wilson's speechwriter?
I assume it was him.
That's right, himself. He's the last president who wrote his own speeches, except for the very end after his stroke, and it chagrined him very much not to do that. So he's the one who, this is a man who was such a punctilious stylist, he even used to correct McAdoo on some grammar at times. So he's not going to use a passive voice unless he darn well means to do it. And in fact, later in a speech in 1918, it's actually an off-the-record speech to some foreign journalists, he said, we can't go around imposing democracy if people don't want it for themselves. So I think we've got to be very, very chary of that. The other thing is, Liz, you brought in Merriam. I find it very interesting that Merriam was, in effect, doing for FDR what Wilson did for himself. That in other words, giving the intellectual flesh to this. I'm an admirer of FDR too, but only up to a point. I don't think you have the intellectual depth. You don't have the education. You don't have the sophistication. Well, maybe of another kind in FDR, but I don't think these are the same things. And I was interested that both of you, were particularly Ted, brought in, and please don't call him Teddy. He didn't call himself that. Brought in Theodore Roosevelt. I think there, if you're looking at FDR, it's the interplay and the conflict between the two of them. But I don't know whether Patty would agree with me, but I think TR was much the stronger influence and much more the role model for FDR.
I knew there was a moment would come in this session when someone would display a far greater knowledge of Wilson than I possess. I'm just relieved it came as late in this session as it did. But I couldn't agree more. That was beautifully put, and I completely agree with everything you said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is Patty here? Is Patty was here? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. It would be great to hear from you.
I think that TR was the great model for FDR, and also I'm working on a book about Wilson's presidency, and one of the main minor characters in it is FDR, who's in Washington at that time, and Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and I see that as kind of his apprenticeship for the presidency. He's very closely watching everything Wilson is doing and taking notes on economic policy, thinking about foreign policy, has a lot of ideas of his own. So he has his fifth cousin Teddy as a great influence, and then he has a chance to watch Wilson up close. So I think all those things figured in what he ultimately decided to do and how he saw the world.
Oh, here's a question for some time.
This is really, this is a discourse that I'm a political theorist. I teach at the University of Virginia. I don't know very much about Woodrow Wilson. I don't know very much about this tradition. But it seems to me that going back to your question about continuity, a large part of how you answer that question, it seems to me, would depend on how we assess the effect of the Cold War on the way in which we draw up these categories. It seems to me that the Cold War exerts a kind of massive sort of black hole-like gravitational pull on a lot of our thinking and a lot of our categorization since the middle part of the 20th century. And I guess one question that I have for Ted and the other people who are more informed about Wilson than I am is whether this kind of ideologization of the liberal, this Manichaean division of the world into axes of evil and good and so forth, which occurs as part of the whole liberal, the way in which liberalism gets redefined in relation to this interlocutor opponent of the totalitarianism. That's a whole layer of gloss that has been spread very thickly on the way in which we even conceive of the notion of the liberal today. And I guess the question about Wilson for me would be, and again I'm not equipped to answer it, is whether when Ted in his paper, you mentioned that there were these kind of strongly kind of religious components, and certainly a discourse that is in various ways redolent of that Manichaean view. But how deeply woven into the Wilsonian conception that really is, whether we're tempted to read a kind of later Cold War kind of thinking into Wilson that just isn't necessarily really there. And I'm not myself equipped to answer that question, but it does seem to me that the question about continuity hinges, at least in part, on how much we discount or how much we weigh in the mix the effect of the Cold War experience in shaping our thinking about the liberal.
Well, the Cold War certainly includes that kind of Manichaean language very clearly. It's there in the long telegram and NSC 68, and a lot of presidential rhetoric, presidents from both parties. And it's, you could call it an elaboration of thoughts that are in Wilson. You might even say it's more similar than we remember. And there are moments when he's really descriptive about the Germans and German militarism. It's this kind of secret dark force in the world. It's a sort of blight that Americans and freedom-loving peoples have to fight against. Not that different from the way Stalin, Soviet communism is described. But religion, I find, it's an enormously complicated topic, of course, and we all know that. But I want to say something that may be a little surprising as a liberal historian, which is I don't think we should be afraid of religion. I think Wilson writes quite movingly in religious language at many moments. Probably not those moments when he's using scare tactics to describe Germany, but at other moments he does write movingly, and I think we need to get a little more comfortable with that kind of language than most of us are, most Democrats and most liberals, because if we aspire to represent Americans in a democratic way, we have to speak in a language that Americans speak, and a lot of Americans do speak in that language, and there are good aspects to religion as well as bad aspects to it. And I think we need to get over our fear of entering into the world of religion. And I found it sort of comes up every generation and then vanishes again. And it's a sort of spin-off of the question of who is a realist and who is an idealist, who is using religious language and who isn't. But Lincoln, who's one of the great scoffers at religion of the 19th century, early in his life, uses very moving religious language towards the end of his presidency, and extremely moving. Second inaugural address is one of the great statements of a kind of civil religion in our history. And it's there in the founders, although under the radar a little bit, and it's there in the people before the founders. And this sense that a new world is coming, whether you call it the UN or the League of Nations or the new world of 2009 when we have a new president, is in itself a kind of a religious thought, that a better world is available to us. And it's not something we necessarily need to be afraid of.
And so just a very quick comment on the Cold War, because that was a piece of your question, answer in a wartime Rooseveltian foreign policy framework. I'm fascinated by the differences and the contrast between the negotiation of the Bretton Woods regime, for instance, and Soviet participation, which was seen as a realistic prospect, right? The Soviets signed initially and then unsigned, in effect, later, and the design of the Marshall Plan, right, which is barely 3 years later, closer to 4 years later, where the design of the Marshall Plan is really much more as a Cold War instrument on the U.S. side, based on lessons learned from the Bretton Woods experience, that the Soviets won't sign up for something where they have to open their books, for instance. And so those policymakers knew going in that the Soviets would refuse to participate in the Marshall Plan, and so that would be a kind of international public relations high ground for U.S. diplomats to take. But I don't think that was necessarily the perspective at the Bretton Woods negotiations, and so it's a very fast-changing landscape, even as late as the 40s, mid-40s.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I agree. And I think important as the Cold War is, it seems to me that what happens is that the Soviet challenge, the Soviet problem, is incorporated into an already fairly crystallized program that, one of the great virtues of Liz's book is she says, let's not look at the period between 41 and 46 through the lens of the Cold War and see what difference it makes. And the difference it makes, I think, is that she shows, as she just said, that there was she doesn't say this. What I would say is there was the goal, the effort to secure a preponderance of power and the capacity to remake the international order in a fundamental way was already in place. And there was a question, how will the Soviets fit into this? And increasingly it became clear that they weren't going to fit very well at all. But even if you look at a document like NSC 68, one of the startling things about that document is at some point the writers of the document say, even if the Soviet Union did not exist, we would still want to move in this direction. And thank God they exist, because that gives us a way of persuading the American people that we need to do so.
Thanks.
Yes. I thought there was someone who hadn't had a chance.
Yeah, my name's Caleb Rossiter. I work for Congressman Bill Delahunt, who chairs a subcommittee on House Foreign Affairs. Listening to this discussion of liberal internationalism reminds me of the quote attributed to Mahatma Gandhi when someone asked him, how do you feel about Western civilization? He said, it would be a good idea. Is liberal internationalism often liberal, is the question. Liberal I would define as, does it promote human rights and self-determination in some sense? Although even Wilsonian self-determination, as he learned at trying to deal with the Balkans, at the peace settlements after World War II, relating to many of your comments about Africa today, is very difficult when the entities are not nations. As we're learning in Kenya, unfortunately now, even in countries that appear to have put the national question to rest in Africa because of the artificial lines, there are many nations within a country. And it's hard to say how you do self-determination at the national level when the nations are not where the lines of the country are. But if you think of liberal internationalism, you would think of Jimmy Carter bringing human rights to the table, and yet the disaster in Somalia didn't start in '93. It started in '79 when Carter backed a Marxist dictator, Siad Barre, because he gave us bases for the Middle East Rapid Deployment Force, leading to the terrible civil war that came. Or Carter intervening twice in Zaire to keep Mobutu in power, dropping in Belgian paratroopers and Moroccan paratroopers on U.S. planes because of our access to strategic minerals in Zaire, particularly down in Shaba. Or Bill Clinton, liberal internationalist, but record arms sales to dictators who were cooperative with our military policies, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey at the time, a very repressive regime. So it makes me think that looking through the documents talked about today and the speeches, that the problem we have in the world with a sense that our rhetoric and our reality don't match, or more crudely, the problem of hypocrisy, goes back a little bit farther. And I guess my question for the panel is, how do these, either as policymakers or as speechwriters, Wilson and both Roosevelts, relate to the giant hypocrisy that still overhangs our relations with the developing world, which is European colonialism in the 20th century, which was a civilizing mission from the European perspective and just a crass holding of power in a brutal, brutal fashion for the rest of the world. At the time of the 1919 speeches here in the conference, self-determination, all the European powers, of course, are tightening their hold economically on Africa and Asia. After World War II, Ho Chi Minh thought he could cite our Declaration of Independence and convince us not to bring the French back to Vietnam. In his inaugural address, he cited the Declaration. That didn't work. De Gaulle convinced Truman that his power in France hinged on being credible in Indochina, and back came the troops, much to everybody's dismay, a couple million deaths later. So even though George Bush gets hit with the hypocrisy problem, the terrible reduction in American favorability towards American policy overseas that we've seen in the last 7 years, which our subcommittee actually did 10 hearings on last year, looking region by region at what's happened. Certainly it's fallen, but it wasn't like Bush invented this problem of rhetoric versus reality. We saw over and over again that people in the Middle East were saying, well, if he's so in favor of democracy, why is he keeping the House of Saud and Mubarak in power, etc.? So it seems like this problem with hypocrisy, whether our words have anything to do with our international military structure, goes back at least to 1919.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, I think to make persuasive arguments, we have to acknowledge the mistakes on our side. Totally agree. And I think about colonialism, it frustrates me also that the world has largely lost touch with that memory, that the United States under FDR was the final revolution he was about to unleash on the world had he lived, was the dismantling of the colonial apparatus, perhaps, but it seemed likely to happen. And now we are perceived in the Middle East as the great colonial power, and we were not a colonial power in the Middle East, and we need to tell that history a little better than I think we do.
Yeah, I mean, just say something quickly on Roosevelt and decolonization, because I stand by an assertion that I make in the book about that actually decolonization was one of the developments that American planners, actually including Roosevelt, I think, failed to anticipate in their wartime planning for a post-war world. I mean, it's other historians coming up to me and saying, well, what about the scene at the Atlantic Charter? That you also Atlantic Charter negotiations that actually I also write about, where Roosevelt's on the record, browbeating Churchill for colonies as sources of instability, and Roosevelt is also on the record talking about a 50-year period of tutelage for Korea. The kind of self-determination that interested Roosevelt initially, and especially interested Churchill consistently, for Churchill, it was self-determination for white European nations currently then under the Nazi yoke in 1941. That's what he meant when he agreed to terms about self-determination in the Atlantic Charter, and stands up in the House of Commons to explain a month later. That's what prompts his speech. I did not become the king's first minister to preside over the dismantlement of the. And for Roosevelt too, I think what he's interested in the dismantlement of imperial trade preference regimes, and I think that in the design of the United Nations Charter, the United Nations system, there's an assumption on the part of these American planners, and then obviously this continues past Roosevelt's death in April of '45, that the United States is going to continue to dominate that institution, including numerically, in the General Assembly, and are really completely blindsided by maybe especially the rapid pace, let's put it that way, of decolonization, and certainly the whole concept of a non-aligned movement.
It's interesting, and the talks, when presented, look at texts. Americans love texts. The discussion is about action versus text. As a historian, I have a concern about building history on text, precisely because they can't. Americans love doctrine. Religious doctrine is just one doctrine, and the doctrines are bound to be traduced in reality. And I think this is part of the difficulty. If you look at Wilson, I think where we really see his notion of self-determination at work is in the negotiation of the armistice agreement. Essentially the surrender of Germany between September and November 1918. Where he uses this notion, he takes the 1917 peace without victory and he applies it about international peace will depend upon domestic institutions, and he pushes the Germans a bit. I mean, they have their own reasons, of course, toward a revolutionary outcome. I guess some balance is needed. I mean, the Beard of 1934, the book on the national interest, is a very powerful beard. The Beard of 1940, to my mind, maybe he gets a bad rap, but he does seem to have gone over the edge. And we're always looking for places on this sort of metro line of intervention where we can climb on and where we can get off. And we won't do it. We won't be saved by texts alone. My own view is that Wilson is a much more powerful intellect than Franklin Roosevelt. But I think if I had to trust somebody's instinct for, coming to terms with reality, in a certain sense, it would be Roosevelt. So I guess I'm just cautious about using texts. I'd like to say something about Jeffrey Hurst's comment originally. Roosevelt taught us, or it starts there, that security doesn't depend upon the borders alone. This seems to me the question.
I'm sorry, it doesn't depend upon.
That American security can't be defended just at this side of the water.
Yeah, right.
I think what happened is actually something else, for better or worse, and that is that with Roosevelt and with Wilson in some ways, we define security as consisting of a climate of values and not a physical attack. Pearl Harbor provided the physical attack to make this, to be able to depart from this case. And then increasingly we depended upon a community of values which, perhaps brought us to this situation. Clearly 9/11 was an attack on the United States territory and could fill even probably John Adams' criteria. Don't look for monsters elsewhere. That you have to invent them elsewhere to destroy. But it seems to me it's the transition to values as a type of criteria of security, and that's implicit early on. And I guess I'm sympathetic to Liz because she talked about prudence. I see no way of doing deciding what we want except with a case-by-case analysis. And that's, in fact, the great virtue of conservatives, if they are conservative and not just doctrinaire. They do ask for prudence.
I say, there's just so much in what you say. Can I just say something specifically about the text, the study of text piece of it, which I think is fascinating? I mean, I'm interested in how ideas intersect with action and at the sort of front end, and I think that it's really. It's more of an iterative dialogue, I guess, between the rhetoric that can be reflected in a speech or in a text, but that's very thin, but how it then enters public discourse, is worked through in trying to, there are institutions that try to realize these aspirations with obviously mixed success and failure. But then there are also constituencies that seize on these ideologies and transform them for their own purposes and effectively send them back, specifically to, you see Churchill kind of hoist by his own petard for some things that he agreed to in the course of the Atlantic Charter negotiations. And so I think it's, I get a lot of questions that are kind of, the Atlantic Charter, rhetoric or reality, or the Four Freedoms, rhetoric or reality. I mean, I know that's not what you're saying, but it goes to this idea of just somehow studying the text and taking a snapshot of it. And I don't think that's what it's really about. That again, it's because it's an iterative relationship. It's a moving target, and that you can't study it by just taking a snapshot of it at a given moment in time, and that's where the transformation comes from, frankly, is constituencies that may be unsympathetic to or have completely different agendas than the original intentions of the thin rhetoric generator. Nelson Mandela writes about receiving the Atlantic Charter and rewriting the African National Congress Charter based on the Atlantic Charter. Is that what Churchill had in mind? I don't think so. And so, again, I think it's that iterative quality that interests me about starting with text.
Have in mind the rights of African Americans
right.
in the United States. We know that.
No, absolutely.
An issue, and self-determination was not crafted to that end.
Mm-hmm.
It's true, I think, insofar as people here were invited because there's supposedly some affinity to liberalism. We all believe in values in some sense as a guideline, but again, how much we're able, where and when, I think, has to be decided on a case-by-case.
I don't think any of us disagree with that. And John Cooper said that Wilson wasn't advocating intervention everywhere. I mean, that these were words, and we all know they're words, and I think we are quite interested in actions, too. I mean, I think the central act of his life was the decision to send 2 million American boys into conflict, but ideas lead to actions, and I do find the speeches a rich mother lode of information. I mean, but to read them skeptically, I think is important. But I just want to say I don't think this is supposed to be a popularity contest between Wilson and FDR, which. Going back to the World War II question, too.
Wilson was smarter.
I, too,
Fine.
I agree completely. I think I would rather have, I trust FDR's common sense also. I'm a great admirer of FDR, and in fact, I think I write more enthusiastically about him in my book. But the continuities are fascinating. So.
Yes, yeah.
Well, apropos of the FDR-Wilson comparison, I'm reminded of the famous remark about FDR that he had a second-rate mind but first-rate temperament, and which I think sums up the contrast with Wilson pretty well. The privileging of action over text in the American context runs into a problem, it seems to me, and namely that to an unusual degree we are a doctrinaire nation, a nation with the soul of the church. And so looking at announced doctrine is never the whole story in the American context, but it's rarely beside the point, it seems to me. And so the idea of a movement back and forth between text and deed is very useful. And in that context, I want to put on the table one of the Wilson speeches that Ted reproduces a portion of in his paper, because it seems to me that it raises the question of the usable past, one of the organizing ideas of this conference, in a very, very forcible way. Let me just read a few sentences so that people who don't have the papers know what we're talking about. This is Wilson, I believe, during the 1912 presidential campaign. So not a trivial throwaway moment, where he says, and I quote, "I believe that God presided over the inception of this nation. I believe that God planted in us the vision of liberty. I believe that men are emancipated in proportion as they lift themselves to the conception of providence and of divine destiny, and therefore I cannot be deprived of the hope that is in me, in the hope that not only concerns myself, but the confident hope that concerns the nation, that we are chosen and prominently chosen to show the way to the nations of the world how they shall walk in the paths of liberty." Now, it's clear that the current president believes that that's a usable past, because it's a pretty good précis of the second inaugural address. And so you don't, it seems to me, I absolutely agree with Professor Hearst, that we shouldn't jump over the New Deal. But neither, it seems to me, should we avoid looking at Wilson himself. Because it seems to me that that sentiment that he articulated in 1912, whether it's a usable past, is part of the present. And the question is, how do we orient ourselves towards this utterance?
Can I reply to that? I think that is very, very dangerous to see this as somehow, I don't know what we call it, Wilson's Sermon on the Mount or Wilson's Ten Commandments, that's Wilson on the role of providence. He has many other things to say about it. I would be very, very chary of doing that.
Well, I'm a humble political scientist, not an historian. I'm delighted by the aggressive presentism of this meeting. It makes my life a lot easier. But if Wilson doesn't mean this, then I need a real re-education on what Wilson thought about these matters, because this sounded like Woodrow Wilson to me, but I yield to Ted.
Well, it's an interesting speech and an interesting passage of the speech. It's more extreme than I think most of us are comfortable with. It's saying basically God has put his finger across the Atlantic Ocean and created a country for the redemption of mankind, which is a rather extreme statement.
God was already in Europe to begin.
You're right. He was on an airplane flying. But I do think we need to be comfortable with patriotism. And that's something that I probably learned as a speechwriter for Bill Clinton. But there is a tendency, whether it's Charles Beard or Madison, Wisconsin in 1969, to not be comfortable with the great figures of American history, whether it's Lincoln or Jefferson. All of them were profoundly flawed human beings, but I think we need to come to a kind of peace with our past and to be able to speak patriotically about a pretty impressive history, but always acknowledging the shortcomings at the same time. So that's a far too extreme statement than I would be comfortable in a speech in the current election. But I do think, whether it's Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, we need comfort with American history.
Well, for my part, that's precisely the sentiment that is least, that I regard as, I would hope, least usable in our past. That is the past we should be abusing. That's the abusable past. Unfortunately, it's not. It's the preeminent past. You're right. And that to me goes to the heart of Wilson and to the heart of the liberal internationalist tradition. It's extreme, sure, but all the better for it. And that is precisely, there's no better statement of the missionary position than that speech. And that to me is the tradition that is problematic, troubling, and in need of radical revision.
Listening to this conversation about continuities and change and over the 20th century and the relationship between ideas and action, I want to throw in one more factor, and that is that from Roosevelt's time on, certainly, and arguably before that, Theodore Roosevelt, there's a need to talk to the American people about what's going on. the expansion of the press and the media, the need to make these ideas palatable for mass consumption, the role of the media in turn in reshaping these ideas. And that's something that nobody's addressed yet that I'm very interested in. There's lots of Cold War literature that talks about presidents needing to scare the hell out of the American people, or earlier dealing with Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt about needing to frame war aims in such a way that will light a fire under the people. And I wonder if people here could address that as well, because surely that has to be part of the conversation.
Well, I agree that open statements of our foreign policy would be welcome in the current debate from candidates from either party. And I think that, I tried to say that was one of Wilson's strengths, that he was trying to say this isn't rocket science. These are basically political problems that we can solve together. And it had been a kind of rocket science up until his presidency. And it remains a very abstract world of thinking for most people. What is foreign policy? And I think clear statements of U.S. policy aims would be welcome. We're not getting too many. All the candidates posture and say they have foreign policy experience, but they very rarely say what they actually intend to do if elected. And so I think more honest dealing would be a hugely welcome feature of campaign rhetoric and would probably help get more votes, too.
Yeah. And I think using the specific example of the Roosevelt, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, I think that the Office of War Information Roosevelt propagandist definitely took note that the difference in reception in terms of connecting with the American people, in terms of FDR's original framing of the Four Freedoms as explicitly international, as I referenced before, and how much better Rockwell's version did. They had been rejected initially by the Office of War Information, and they were sold privately to the Saturday Evening Post, and then became readopted. And of course, were in every school and every public building this image of the Four Freedoms as what the U.S. was fighting for. Again, as these very domesticated images of home and hearth. The only international reference in them, visual reference, is extremely oblique. It's in the Freedom from Fear poster. I don't know if you can recall it. It's so iconic, but the young parents tucking their children into bed, and in a sort of attic room, modest room, where the father is holding a folded newspaper that's talking about the Blitz and the bombing of London. And so there's this kind of subtext of, here are these children in this wooden roofed building, and sort of thank goodness we don't have to worry about that here, kind of thing. And so I think these OWI publicists really took note. And there was a loop that was sort of encouraging Roosevelt to emphasize maybe the other parts of the speech, such as your economic Bill of Rights, because, of course, Americans were very worried about a huge depression coming with demobilization in the wake of World War II.
I've been instructed that it's time to wrap up, and I'm sure we'll get some details on lunch. I'm sure also that there'll be plenty of time to pursue all of these ideas and questions and issues later, but let me take my opportunity here to say that something I should have said a moment ago, and that is I'm all for patriotism, and indeed there are enormous resources in the American past, not always preeminent, that one can draw on to take on that statement of Wilson's, not least the view of Abraham Lincoln, which was that at best we see the purposes of the Lord only through a glass darkly. All right.